Every day for almost 20, 25 years now, Senator Alcides. I imagine this is true for you too. Every day, I ponder what is the state of the economy, not just ours, but that of the United States of America and the world, and what are the prospects for it going forward? It's just something you concern yourself about because so much rides on it, right? For a very long time, that worry did not include what was happening with inflation because inflation in the Bahamas, like the United States, was fairly tamed for many years, hovering around 2%, maybe even less for many, many years. Nobody hardly ever looked at it. And then the pandemic happened, and everything about economic outlook and the pandemic happened after that. And now we have eggflation. In case you don't, some of you who don't live in the Bahamas, let me tell you something. So I have a restaurant and I purchased 30 dozen eggs for $300. That means it was $10 per dozen. This is the wholesale price. Because in the retail market, that same egg is 13, 14, 15, $17, depending on where you go and what egg you're purchasing. And so the notion of inflation has now become as common a discussion as anything else, and where in fact the economy is headed. And we are now going into that session, Global Economic Outlook, Inflation, the Cost of Living, with two persons who are well capable of helping us with this discussion. Therese Turner Jones has spent her career in international financial organizations advising governments on macroeconomic and development challenges. She's experienced in the regional development of Latin America and the Caribbean. Prior to joining the Caribbean Development Bank in 2023, which she is no longer, Therese has gained extensive experience managing a diverse department of development specialists and economists at the Inter American Development Bank in Washington, D.C., and the Caribbean. She remains one of those very potent voices on economic issues in our region, and we are delighted to have her here. She is a Bahamian national and is married and have three daughters. Byron Callan is the managing director of nearly 40 years, a veteran of Wall Street. He spent 3 years on the buy side, most recently as a portfolio manager at Lions Path Capital. From 2007 to 2010, Callan was an analyst and co-founder of Perella Weinberg Partners Aerospace Defense Security Investment Fund. For the previous 2 years, he was a senior vice president at Prudential Equity Group, responsible for A&D equity research. From 1993 to 2005, Callan was first vice president at Merrill Lynch, covering A&D stocks and serving as the sector's global coordinator. For 9 years prior to that, he covered electronic warfare and engineering stocks at PEG. Callan's research has been ranked by Institutional Investor magazine for a total of 15 years, and he was recognized in the 2012 and 2013 Defense News listing of the top most influential people U.S. defense. Callan is a member of the Atlantic Council. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have each of them provide some opening remarks. Then I'm going to engage them in a couple of questions, and then we'll open up to audience questions and answers. We begin with Therese.
Morning, everyone. So happy to be here, especially as a Bahamian who's soon to come home, maybe for good. But thank you so much, Zhivargo, for inviting me, and GIC for sponsoring this space and this time and this opportunity to do some thought leadership together. Those of you who I met last night over dinner, it was really a fabulous opportunity to hear more about GIC. And to hear Dr. Harker this morning was really interesting, and I think it's a good place to start to put this conversation in perspective. I want to thank uh, Jane and the university, and also the minister for being here, and all the special people who represent the university and the faculty and some students who are here. So it's a pleasure. So when I think about this question, and I like how Dr. Harker put it, the only certainty is uncertainty. Um, Today is February 17th, and the Trump administration has been in office for less than a month. And already a lot of what Dr. Harker, how he positioned the US economy, the uncertainty that we're facing today as policymakers in this region, I think in the world, have a lot to do with the fast pace at which those policies are changing in the US. I mean, it's a rapid fire set of bombardment of new policies. So if we keep that as the backdrop, then some of these other things I'm going to say may or may not seem like they make any sense, but I'm going to try. I want to just start off by saying that as an economist, one of the first things you look at when you're talking about an economic outlook is what the IMF is saying. And they updated their World Economic Outlook report of October in January, and the global forecast of around 3.3% is still holding. I think it's slightly below what they were expecting, but for our region, meaning Latin America and the Caribbean, the rate is somewhat lower, 2.7%, and for the Bahamas is even lower. It's under 2%. As the minister notes, the medium-term forecast for the Bahamas is around 1.5% over the next couple of years. For me, that's not a great rate, and the minister knows some of the challenges with trying to get growth up in the Bahamas. But I would say a lot of it was outlined in the last Article 4 consultation that was published just last month for the Bahamas. And they pointed to some really interesting areas that I think we need to focus on. I think the minister is focusing on, and he alluded to those this morning. There are constraints in the tourism sector. We don't have enough hotel rooms. We may not have enough airlift. We're getting lots of cruise visitors, but we know that they spend 10% of a stopover visitor. So when we look at those numbers, you can't. 9 million sounds like a great number of visitors, but really, if only 1.5 million of those are actually staying in hotels, and that rate has been relatively flat for decades. So we have to figure out, if we're going to get 9 million cruise visitors coming through, how can we figure out a way to get them to spend more money? So I think that's the real challenge in tourism. When you look at, so the headline for the update that the IMF did last month was divergent and uncertain. So those are the two words they use to describe the global economic outlook. And if you look at any chart that shows the US economy versus European economies, China, other developed countries, well, the US is way up there and everybody else is trending this way. So I think that is the piece that has most people at the IMF and other IFIs a little bit worried, because it's really quite divergent in terms of where the growth is coming from. The US, I think Harker said it in a really good way. The future looks bright. I think, though, that given all of what I mentioned earlier about the bombardment of new policies of the US government, that is going to be something that's going to occupy the Fed and other thinkers in the US as to how these rapid fire changes in policy, including letting go of federal workers, reducing US aid, just a whole plethora of really high impact policy changes that I think could affect the way the US economy moves in the future. Then that's going to have a knock-on effect in this region, Latin America and the Caribbean. The Bahamas, because 95%, I think that may be the number, of our visitors come from the US and Canada. So that's going to have an impact. We know that whatever happens in the US, we're just a sneeze away from the impact happening here. And it's not just monetary policy, it's trade, it's inflation, it's which goods we have access to, it's technology. All of that, I think, will impact us in a strong way. One aspect on the Bahamian economy that I found very interesting in the report was what I didn't realize, because I had never focused on it, Minister, was this wedge that's growing between GDP per capita in the Bahamas as a share of US GDP versus our peers. So the IMF did a little index, and they had, I think, Suriname in there, Jamaica in there, Panama, Belize in there, St. Lucia in there as comparative countries. And actually, this was stunning for me that we are now less rich on a per capita basis in this group of countries. So that's something I think to focus on. I, as a Bahamian who's been living abroad for 30 years, I've noticed it, but I never saw it quantified like that. So I think that's something that's interesting, and will continue to determine the trajectory of our economic development. But I think it's a challenge. In terms of risk, um, what I would say, inflation, trade wars, the pandemic, the prolonged conflicts, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, a new pandemic, bird flu, climate change, natural disasters will continue to be the big risk. I wanted to talk, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I think everybody knows that the level of debt that any country has is a real harbinger for what happens in the private sector, because private investors are not really looking to flock to countries with high debt levels. Because if your debt level is over a certain percentage, and for small countries like the Bahamas and the Caribbean, that ratio should be close to 60%. Ours is trending downward, but it's still just under 80%. That tends to be a little bit of a red flag for investors to say, well, if debt is that high, let me look at the government's revenue capacity to service this debt. And if it looks like that thing is trending in the wrong direction, which I think we know what that means, it could be that, all right, the way to deal with this is to increase taxation. In the article for report for the Bahamas this year, there are a lot of revenue measures mentioned in there, Minister. I didn't even know about some of them, including income tax and the minimum corporate tax to comply with the OECD law. But I think that's just, it's always something you got to be aware of. And I'm speaking to someone who knows this very well. But obviously, seeing ways in which we can improve the primary surplus, and I see that has been increasing over time, and if it's projected to increase, that should help with your debt levels. But I think the important thing is to make sure the revenue measures aren't are not sort of trying to overcompensate for maybe inefficiencies on the expenditure side, and we need to fix that. Tax expenditures, especially because we know nowadays tax expenditures, meaning incentives for businesses, whether it's a tax-free holiday for something, those tend not to be the right kind of industrial policies that you want to be pursuing right now. So that's something to think about. And of course, if your debt is, if the debt is high, investment in important things like infrastructure that we need to do. Um, we were talking earlier about digital transformation and the need for more of that in the Bahamas. I think we've started off in a really good way with the national ID and being able to do certain things online. But if you look at where other countries are going with digital transformation, once you can eliminate people having to do a face-to-face interaction with someone in a public office, we'll all be happier, right? So if we can drive more of delivery of government services over the internet, Harker talked about fintech and how important that is, but you need a good digital infrastructure in order to have effective fintech. And of course, along with that, things like cybersecurity become really important. Just a couple of words on climate change. We're in one of the most climate disaster-prone regions in the world. Dorian was our latest hit. We've had numerous impacts of hurricanes over my lifetime and in the recent decade. Clearly, we can't change what's going to happen because with the impact of global warming, these natural disasters are coming fast and furious. Even in a country like the US, it's difficult to keep up with natural disasters. However, I think there is a lot that the government and the private sector can do to make sure that we are ready for when these things happen, right? Whether it's taking out the right kind of contingent credit facility, doing insurance, coastal zone management, really enforcing our building codes, because that's some of the, when you see devastation sometimes we look at what's happening in Florida and we say, well, what kind of building code do they have in Florida if all those houses get flattened? But I think it's important if at the front end, we make sure that our physical assets are built to proper standards. Climate change doesn't also just affect, the impact of natural disasters, but we also have issues around pandemics. We saw that with COVID, increasing health costs, reference to insurance costs, not just for shelter, but insurance costs for medical in a region like this are becoming a big part of what consumers have to fork out. And then in the case of agricultural productivity, obviously, when we have natural disasters, that's going to affect yields, and that's going to affect parts of the economy. Livelihoods in the Bahamas aren't largely dependent on agriculture because we don't have a lot of agricultural resources. However, we do have a lot of food insecurity. Our import bill is highly dependent on being able to get food from outside. Again, if we can find ways to produce food to reduce that bill, I think that could be something that could not just engineer economic activity and improve livelihoods for Bahamians, especially in some of the family islands, but it would also reduce our foreign exchange bill for food. I was hoping that Harker would mention something about AI and automation and the future of work. I think it's really important that we start as policymakers to think about it. And I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, the IDB has done a really very important work on the types of jobs that are likely to be automated. There's a lot of information already out there on the US economy, but what is great about this piece of work that was done by IDB last year, they did two things. They generated an index of occupational exposure. So what are those sectors that are likely to be automated, and within 1 year, within 5 years, within 10 years? The numbers are staggering. And by sector, you can see where it's going to start first. Even lawyers, sorry for some of you who are lawyers in this group, but there's some legal services that can be done by AI in the future. But the piece that I like about the report is looking at where there is the likelihood that, well, where the index is lower. So for example, care workers, services, certain types of jobs, education, where it's less likely that these jobs will go away by AI. But I think it's important to start thinking about these issues because it's going to affect our labor market. And I know we tend to think, oh, that's just going to happen in developed economies. No, it's going to happen in emerging economies. It's going to happen in our economy. It's going to happen because when corporations need to reduce costs, they're going to figure out a way to send people home if they can use a program to do it. So just something to think about, and that means workforce preparation, getting the workforce ready. And one issue that always comes up when we talk about digital transformation is, oh, what about the labor? Well, labor doesn't necessarily have to go home just because you automate or do things digitally. That labor can be liberated, skilled up to do better, more high value things. So no need to be afraid that the minister is sending the IT department to say, how can we do things better here? It's about liberating, stop doing things that don't make sense. When I walk into the passport office, I don't want to have to go to 5 different desks to get something done. Sorry. Passport office is close to my heart because I was there at Christmas time and it was kind of painful. But it's just one, but by the way, it's the one service, is one of the services where you can go online and get your passport in 24 hours if you pay extra fee. But in this case, we ran into the office. But what I'm saying is there are ways in which we can do things a lot better. Another report that I read in preparation for today was a World Economic Forum on productivity levels in Latin America and the Caribbean. And labor productivity is the biggest drag on growth performance in this region. So I'm just going to be a nerd for 1 second. The way you get growth in an economy is looking at total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is return on labor and return on capital. If return on labor is negative, which it has been in this region for decades. And that to me suggests that one, we don't have the right type of labor, we don't have enough skilled labor, and we're not augmenting labor with technology. So if that equation is not positive, it's impossible to generate growth, right? Because the way you get growth is when these two things are positive and they work together. So as a policymaker, these are the things you want to focus on. How do you get labor productivity to improve? More investment in education, more investment in skills, more investment in technology. And I think my last, and this all leads to how I think Harker mentioned it. How do you get more innovation in the economy? You only get more innovation when you have those extra skills and you have labor that really can drive doing things differently and being able to do things more efficiently. One point that is very, very important for this economy and the region is the transition to sustainable energy. We mentioned several times how, I know, this is my last point, how expensive electricity is. So, and it affects everything we do. It affects water, it affects tourism sector. 25% of a hotel's cost is electricity. So we cannot be more competitive in our tourism industry unless we bring that electricity cost down. Every Bahamian has a special word for BLP. Is that what they're called now? Or BEC, in my day. BLP, PPL. So I don't need to say more on that, but the technology is there for renewable energy. We have, the country has nationally determined commitments that it made under the Paris Accord to get to net zero within a certain period of time. We have sun, we've got wind, we've got all manner of natural resources that we need to think about. So renewable energy is key. I'm going to stop here before I get kicked off, but just to say that there's a lot, I would agree with the general view that it's an optimistic environment. I think it's dizzying though to try to figure out what these tariffs and Byron's going to get into that, what all these changes in the US economy are going to mean for us in this region. I think this is not the time to bury our heads in the sand, but to really put some good policies on the table and to have serious conversations with the private sector, with civil society about how we move forward. Thank you.
It's on. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. And I think it was just mentioned in my bio, I'm not an economist. I spent most of my career as an analyst covering aerospace and defense companies. And the firm I work with right now, we basically advise institutional investors, some corporations, private equity, hedge funds on what's going on in Washington, D.C. But because I cover the defense sector, I naturally look at a lot of these factors that are going on globally. So I wanted to just start with maybe on a pessimistic note and end on a more optimistic note, but talk about kind of the geostrategic framework that I see right now, because it is challenging and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I characterize it as 5 Ds that people need to ponder or think through. The first D is destabilization. And it really comes from some of these things have been enduring, but they're going to have an impact on the Bahamas, on the region, and obviously on the United States. I'd look at what's been going on in the Middle East, the potential for another Iran-Israel conflict potentially this year. I think probably one of the most interesting destabilizing elements has been the USAID cuts and what that could mean to this region. I was trying to do some background work on what was in the AID budget. The entire website has been taken down, so it's hard to piece together like where all the aid was going. But I do note that their budget in the current fiscal year is about $72 billion. Now, 14 or 15 of that was going to the Ukraine, but for this region, one little fact, I think USAID was providing about 40%, funding 40% of the primary healthcare facilities in Haiti. So when that goes away, what are the implications? What are the ramifications for that? I can't quantify that, but it's something to start thinking through. Is there more regional instability? I'd say the same is true for the rest of the economic healthcare work that AID had been doing in Sudan and Ethiopia and other parts of the world where potentially there are more migration triggers. There are going to be healthcare issues that potentially could arise out of this too. So destabilization is one thing to start thinking through. Disinformation would be the second D. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. The events in South Korea might be a good example of what disinformation can do to a political system when you have a leader who has fallen down a rabbit hole and believes in certain things that are completely divorced from what's going on. I don't know how you solve that here, but again, it's something to start thinking about. Disintegration would be the third D. And I think for this, if I look back over the longer arc of what organizations like the United Nations had been involved in, they've been nowhere to be seen in the Middle East conflict or what's been going on with Russia and Ukraine. The meetings that took place in Munich this weekend at the Munich Security Conference really, to me, can raise some questions about, is NATO going to disintegrate? Will you have a fracturing in a global security alliance or a North Atlantic security alliance that you could argue, but I think has probably imparted some stability. World Health Organization, the US withdrawing from that, World Trade Organization. So these institutions that have been built up are now disintegrating, in my view. Deglobalization would be the fourth D. This gets back to the tariffs, the threats not just of US tariffs, but the retaliation. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I guess an undercurrent also is there of economic nationalism. It's not a new theme. It started on the Trump administration. The Biden administration certainly pursued this, trying to reshore industry to the United States. I don't know what that does to inflation and input costs, but if you're moving work out of countries with much lower wages and pulling it to the United States, I would assume if I buy a car that's entirely made in North America or in the United States, I'm going to ultimately pay a lot more for that. The last point to make is demographics, and demographics is destiny. We've always heard that. But I think there are two overlays to think through. First, it's going to be what happens to immigrants in the United States. The administration that had come in had some pretty large expectations about how many undocumented workers they could get out of the country. That's going to cost a lot of money to do, but it will have impacts on some of the services industries, construction, healthcare, hospitality, agriculture. Yeah, if some of this starts to play through. And then there's some sub themes that I think are important to at least think through, which is specific age cohorts. In the United States, this is something that was pointed out last year by the Secretary of the Army, because they recruit high school graduates. 2025 is going to be the peak year for high school graduates in the United States. We went from around 3.3 million in 2009. The peak this year is about 3.8 million. And then if you just look back to birth rates, it starts to fall down. So back to an era where you see these help wanted signs. Yes, maybe there's been a bit of softening, although I tend to agree. I think the labor market is still going to be a challenge, particularly in some of these areas where you're just not going to have people to work. You should be able to retask some of them, but in these entry-level jobs, I think it's going to be a real interesting policy challenge, and it should have ripple effects. On the debt, we're in another very interesting period in the United States because we typically see Congress act to do something to rein in federal spending when deficits hit 5% of GDP. I have a neat little chart that shows us Graham and Hollings, the Budget Control Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, were all kind of triggered by deficits hitting this 5% number. We're on the verge of taking deficits potentially higher. I'm not terribly worried about that. I don't think we have a debt crisis in the United States. David Kotak, I think, wrote a very interesting little essay on this fact. Maybe David might touch on some of his arguments, but as much as Congress says we have a debt crisis, we have to cut spending, we have to do something about the deficit, somehow we always find a way to spend a little bit more money. And we're not there yet. I actually think that if you look at public debt that's held, the federal debt that's held by the public, it's around 100% of GDP. I have not seen anybody come up with a real good answer about how much debt could the U.S. really sustain. Um, President, your former university had, or your current university, former place at Wharton has a very good study that was done, the Penn budget model. They basically said you could take this up to 150% without having major dislocations in the economy. Now that's going to be highly sensitive to rate assumptions and what goes on, but I think there's still going to be some room here. I think if we have a Liz Truss moment in the United States where there's a lot of concern about some fiscal policies that are going to throw the wheels off the bus, I assume the Fed would be able to act on that. And when I look at the long arc of debt to GDP ratios in the United States, we tend to get spikes around wars or pandemics. The rest of the time, it's not the crisis or issue that I think you might read about or hear about today. At least that's my view. Other people clearly think differently on that. I just became a grandfather last week, so I have to end on a more optimistic note because I have to think about now my granddaughter's future, not just my children's future. But some of the things that I think could work out, hopefully for the better, maybe take some of the edge off these inflationary pressures. And again, this is a global perspective. Let's see what comes out of the Russia-Ukraine war. If in fact there could be an enduring ceasefire, a workable one, and it may result in some of the commodity flows that had been bottled up in the Ukraine, Russia. That might help. Maybe, although the markets are thinking differently right now, there's an easing in the need for Europe to spend so much more on defense. They're going to have some interesting fiscal hurdles they're going to be jumping over. I would agree absolutely, Therese. I think artificial intelligence, if it's a way to improve productivity without significant job displacement, and I think that's something you have to be mindful of, the people who will lose jobs because of they're going to need to be retrained or repurposed. So that has to be a whole approach to artificial intelligence. Maybe some of these global organizations are disintegrating, but I think it's one person I heard speak recently mentioned you could see these so-called blue blocks reemerge that might take regional roles that are being left open by global organizations that aren't delivering on these. Energy prices, let's see. Maybe renewables, could help. I don't know if we're going to see the 3 million barrel a day goal that our new Treasury Secretary has talked about for energy production. But if energy prices come down, I think that clearly would be a help too. And I'd say finally, there could be a blowback. We're doing a pretty interesting experiment in the United States right now where I think people are going to see a lot of basic government services cut that they may not realize that their families, or their friends are relying on. And I've cited a poll that is produced fairly frequently by Associated Press and the University of Chicago, basically ask people in the United States, do you think federal spending is too high, too low, or about the right amount? So the majority, 60%, say it's too high. We've got to cut federal spending. And then the rest of the poll goes, well, where do you think we ought to be spending more money on? We should be spending more money on education. We should be spending more money on Social Security. We should be spending more money on healthcare. We should be spending more money on infrastructure. The one area there was a high percentage of people who believe we should be cutting was foreign aid. That's 1% of the US federal budget. So maybe, I think when people start to see and feel what this means, there could be some change. It is President's Day in the United States, and I read a quote. I don't know if it's really came from Abraham Lincoln. It may have been attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but I thought it was a good way at least to finish my little talk, which is apparently he said the best way to predict the future is to create it. So that's my charge to you.
That is an absolutely appropriate quote to end on, given the one question I have before I open up the floor to your questions. The best way to predict the future is to create it. We have some policymakers in the room. We have some people who create policymakers in the room. Given what you see in the global economic system, two things you think we can absolutely do to create a better future for whom? I suggest to you that there are lots of people who have no job, who are thinking, where can I find a job? There are far too many people with jobs whose anxieties rest around, I get paid, but I don't get paid nearly enough. And there are businesses who think, if I had the opportunity, I'd create some more jobs for people who need to make more money. What do you think can be done? Two things. I know they might have many, but two things.
Sometimes I think it really gets back down to, in the United States, I spend time on shipbuilding, for example. The U.S. Navy wants to expand the number of ships it's building. There are no people with welding skills. They're actually very good jobs if you can find the vocational schools. We spend a lot of time on university education. I absolutely agree, STEM. But yeah, some of these very basic things that you can have a good middle class lifestyle and frankly a rewarding career. But you can see I have some gray here. When I went to high school in the United States, we had shop class. I mean, we were using, band saws and welding and all this stuff. My kids went to school in suburban New York. They didn't teach them any of that stuff. So how to operate a chainsaw, these very basic things. So I think some of that is going to be just
Some matching
skilling.
issues around.
And it really has to start. It has to start. Yes, it's helpful to do it when someone's in their 20s or 30s or 40s, but I also think it has to be at a high school level in some ways.
Okay. Incidentally, we have a ship yard in Grand Bahama that brings in on an annual basis about 3,000 people to do the kind of things you talked about. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a big fan of reinventing human capital. I think.
Mike. Yeah. No. Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so investment in human capital, starting with early childhood education, all the way through. We're not producing high schoolers who are fit for purpose for the kinds of jobs that we need today. And it's also not just about academic learning anymore. It's about soft skills because we know that kids aren't getting it at home anymore.
Well,
And this is global. This is not just in this region. Something is happening where, and I know I've been reading a lot this week, but I just read this piece on what's happening with young people in the U.S. after the pandemic. Some not wanting to leave home, only being able to communicate on a device, completely disaffected from society. So I think if our schools, our faith-based institutions, our community organizations can engage our young people to make them fit for purpose. So that's one. The second thing is, in terms of matching, we aren't using data to any great degree to make decisions. And I'm going to say this across the region. We are still flying by the seat of our pants a lot. The data and data now is not just the GDP numbers or what statistical offices are doing. There are all manner of ways to collect data today. MasterCard has an amazing data set, right? MasterCard can tell you where our visitors spent their last $2. Okay, MasterCard has that information. So we have to find ways to use our administrative data as well. So NIS information, school information, matching the failing students with the school so we know which schools need to have proper interventions. Our health data, right? So short answer to very I think, very complex question you just asked is more investment in human capital, better use of data and analytics, because now we have it. It's not difficult. Our telephone ICT companies have all manner of data. We need to figure out a way to be able to deal with the misinformation, because we know that a lot of people are basing their decisions, whether they're political ones or otherwise, on a lot of misinformation. And I think it's one of the biggest threat, I would say, not just to the region, but to everybody living on the planet today, is the amount of disinformation that is available, whether it's, the lack of science-based information, the lack of evidence on what's being purported to be truth. And people are just confused. And so what are they doing? They're watching TV and they're looking at cat videos on their phone all day long. So I think we need to find ways to engage the potential we have, which is our human capital, and get back to some values. And by that, I don't mean, whatever. I'm talking about what's important for a country to move forward. Establishing a set of behavioral values: integrity, collaboration, inclusion, diversity, transparency. And that's the way, I think, to move forward. When we have values like that, that we can say, all right, and these are the things that reflect those values in my society. You get some social cohesion, you get some social dynamics around wanting to be the best. And there are countries that do this really well: Estonia, Mauritius, Ireland. I think Ireland is probably the best country that offers good set of policies for this region, because small country, came out a lot of difficulty in a big region, and they managed to invest in human capital and become, one of the stars of the world. So I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot out there that we can do.
Well,
Sorry, I've taken a lot of your time.
Yeah, no, it's okay. One of the things that I might note is at the University of the Bahamas, the government of the Bahamas has engaged the Government and Public Policy Institute to do a massive study on factors affecting learning outcomes among school-aged children. So we have been engaged in this study now for the last 2 years as a part of collecting the data that is telling us what is affecting the learning outcomes in the country. And also, I do something with I've been teaching leadership skills to young people for the last 14 years, 11 and 12th grade students. We do an exercise at the beginning of the program that's called the one-page miracle. It is a question that's put to students that ask, what do you want out of this life? And for each feature of their lives, physical, mental, social, and otherwise, they are asked to answer questions related to what they want. And the one thing we stress is you have to divorce what you want from any influence in your life, your parents. This has to be about what you want. When we finished doing that exercise, I asked them, how do you feel? This is invariably the answer. I have more clarity and I have more motivation about what I want to do in this world, which is a part of human capital development, which is generating within young people a curiosity about their own ambitions and interest in the world, and then tying that to the opportunities that might exist at university or PTDI or some certificate course or the other, to the points that you've been making. Questions for yourselves, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir.
Therese, you mentioned.
Mike, you want, yeah, bring the mic to him, yes. We want to record this because one of the things we're going to do with these sessions is we're going to treat them as profiles for future exposure to the general public.
Yeah, you mentioned growing GDP. One of the equations for GDP, as was mentioned earlier, is the workforce times productivity. But the one thing everybody misses out on, especially economists, is you have to have money. I don't care how productive you are or how big your workforce is, without money, there's nothing happening. Very difficult to change the GDP in the Bahamas because productivity is low, and you can't just change that overnight. And you can't change the demographics overnight either. You can actually bring in people to do the jobs that are needed, but there's a lot of controversy about that. But what you can change is access to money. I listened carefully to the Davos report. All the multilateral leaders were saying Europe is behind the United States primarily because Europeans don't have access to capital, and there's too much regulation in Europe. In Bermuda, years ago, they got rid of exchange control. And the amount of money that comes into Bermuda from the portfolio investments of Bermudians outside the country, in terms of dividends, rents, etc., is more than comes in from tourism. And that's why I've been advocating for years. We have to relax exchange control to get the US dollars into the country that we need. And I could guarantee you, in 18 months, if we did that, the Bahamian economy would boom.
So I'm not a big fan of exchange controls. I worked for a long time on Jamaica. I lived in Jamaica for 10 years. And Jamaica liberalized its exchange control regime back in the early 90s. Once you do that, though, you need to have really good supervision of your banks. Any Fed will tell you that in order to do that, you got to make sure that you've got good central bank supervision of banks. Now, because the Bahamas has a currency that is pegged to the US dollar and we have parity, one of the biggest jobs of John Roll is to make sure we don't lose that, because if that's, and we have a former central banker here, so he can also talk to that. But if central bank governor, if we want to maintain that parity, it means that you've got to put in, absent all of these other things I just mentioned, making sure, and I think we do have good regulations of our banking sector, but we need to be careful that we don't lose control of the inflows and outflows of foreign capital, because we don't produce, we have no commodity, we have very few commodities, we're a service economy, everything is imported. We got those oil bills to pay, we have to make sure that the resources are there. I'm with you. I think, I don't, my experience of exchange controls in the Bahamas is not that complicated to get foreign currency. Bahamians don't have an issue getting foreign currency. So the process of getting it may be a little cumbersome. You got to apply for it, rah. But and opening up a foreign currency account here, if you're not earning foreign currency, it's difficult to do that. But I would say I'm more in favor of liberalizing the capital account so that we can have more investments in the Bahamas. If you look at our balance of payments account, we have a huge deficit because there is a lot of foreign investment in the country, and there is a charge on that for the future. So if I'm the central bank governor, I'm also paying attention to when those corporates are ready to take those profits out. So this is not an easy job to do. And because we're a small country, small economy, that has to be managed really properly. Other countries in this region are doing it, but Jamaica, with a floating exchange rate and an open capital market, they are able to attract more foreign currency in. But I think that decision is one that central bank has to take, and it has to make sure that everything is in place before that happens.
Bill?
Question for Byron on your 5Ds. There are probably some winners and losers from a cost of living standpoint. Could you just speak to that, whether in aggregate it's net inflationary or disinflationary? And when you look around the world, can you clearly identify where net winners or losers might be?
Bill, I can't right now. I don't have a firm, what are the impact on agricultural regions? If we get in an agricultural trade war with, maybe parts of the United States. I don't know. But I've not taken it to that level of drilling down to here are the winners and losers of it. I mean, I generally think it's going to be a pretty good environment for global security companies, given some of the factors that I mentioned. And that may be a sad thing to say, but I think that's going to be the reality, given those 5Ds of what we're looking at over the next couple of years.
May I ask a simpler question about Israel and Iran?
Yeah.
You made that comment. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
There's been a view that Israel had dealt with Hamas in Gaza, and they dealt with Hezbollah, and now they're going to deal with Iran, and they're going to deal with Iran's nuclear weapons capacity. Whether they can do that independently is an open question. I could get into the capability of the Air Force. They really do need U.S. aid in that, U.S. direct participation in that kind of military operation. Where this goes, I mean, if in fact it happens, the President Trump came out and said he wants peace in the Middle East. So that's a highly destabilizing event if that happens. Because the Iranian, and then what does that do to global energy prices is going to be an interesting little spike to play through. You can go down other rabbit holes about does it destabilize Iran? Does that country then have the type of unrest that we've seen in Syria, other parts of the world? How does that play through? So it's something I think about. Yes.
I have, there are lots of people across the United States, Canada, and the Bahamas, the region, who are very concerned about the cost of living. One of the things that I find interesting is policymakers who talk about tackling the cost of living, even reducing the cost of living. How practical is it that policymakers can actually bring down the cost of living?
Can I? So it's difficult because we're price takers. We're importing oil. Oil at a certain price is a world price. We have what I would say unequivocally, we have an inefficient electricity provider. So getting electricity and water is related to the price of electricity. Labor costs in the Bahamas are quite high. So there's only so much, there's not a lot of tinkering that this minister can do to try to affect any of those things. I think what we want to be doing is trying to make sure that for every dollar the government spends, it's really being spent efficiently. So whether that's reinvesting in renewable energy sector or investing in providing the right environment so that the extent to which we can't grow a lot here, but the extent to which some things can be grown here to reduce the bill, that would make sense. But that it's super, super difficult. Our budget depends largely on import tariffs. So he would be loath to reduce import costs to reduce the cost of imported food, because that then affects his budget and so on. So it's super complicated. I mean, the Fed even, all right, the Fed, the central bank, our central bank doesn't have a lot of leeway there, but the notion of, how much you tinker with that interest rate, the Fed rate, so that, prices, people aren't, credit costs aren't so high and so on. It's super difficult. So, for governments to be promising to, $3 a dozen eggs, it's kind of crazy. We know that's crazy. But I think it's going to get, to Byron's point, it's hard to answer that question, but it's also going to get much more complicated with tariffs and the trade wars.
So we're price takers.
Yeah.
The U.S. is not. So can a government of the United States of America, as an example, bring down the cost of living?
I think it really, look, one of the issues in the United States has been housing prices. And that's not something that the federal government is necessarily involved in. It really gets down to what local government can do, and it's very arcane things like zoning. The town I live in suburban New York in Connecticut, and they finally made some zoning changes where they're building multifamily housing that's adjacent to a major interstate and a rail line that goes in and out of New York City. So in theory, you can live in these places. You don't need a car. So for people starting out, that's actually a pretty healthy thing to do. But that was a decision that was made by the town of Darien, not the federal government or even the state government. So yes, I absolutely think it can be done, but it's not going to happen. Flip the coin, and today we have inflation. The more we doing it, it has to have that lead of 2 or 3 years and thinking through this and trying, what are the problems you can anticipate? The workforce thing, I think, is going to be another one. I mean, simple scarcity. Find a plumber, a dentist. They're going to have a premium they can charge for their services because there just aren't a lot of them.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Bagnaga, please. Yes, yeah, he was standing for a little bit, sorry. Yes, sir.
Zhivargo, I will really take a page from what you are leaving at. Can we ensure the Bahamian people what will be the energy costs? Every day in the paper, we see this agreement signed, that agreement signed. The last one I saw was the distribution company having a cost of 5.2 cents per kilowatt hour transmitted. Nobody knows about the cost of the other contracts, renewable or otherwise. We have, I think Mrs. Jones can attest to this. We have a problem. We had a problem in Jamaica where a very well-known generation company who promised a world to Jamaica, they defaulted on it because the LNG price, nobody's sure about it, what price they can get it. Mr. Callan would know that President Trump is offering every country where they can sell the LNG to, but they do not know the price of LNG in the Europe is like 10 cents per cubic meter, whereas in the Henry Hub is $3. That's why Mr. Wes Adams thought it best to default on Jamaica, is a commitment to Jamaica, pay 75 cents per kilowatt and take the LNG to Europe, where he can sell it for $10 rather than $3. I think same thing is going to happen here in Bahamas. We are going into this where we are bringing the people who will generate energy. Bahamian people do not know yet what will be the cost of the generation. All that we know is that there are some costs for the renewable energy, and also a big conglomerate here who is promising to generate energy from LNG, but they do not know in the first place what price they will pay for LNG.
Let me
So
rush you to your question, Mr. Bagnaga, please, because
The,
we're running out of
the
time.
question is,
Yeah, thanks.
how far this kind of uncertainty, and I'm asking this question, Mr. Callan and Ms. Jones, how in this situation, what will be their take from their experiences as to what will happen in such a situation where there is a big uncertainty about the energy costs and the effect thereof on the economy?
Super. We'll take that question. We got one more, and then we'll go right into our next session, please. So, yeah, go ahead.
I think the short answer is we need more transparency on the energy policies. So I know this for work I've done at IDB, that a lot of these countries in the region have done an integrated resource plan for energy, looking at how much can we do with fossil fuels, how much with renewables, how much whatever. And also estimating the future demand for energy. That information should not be a secret. that information should be public. And that information should involve a lot of consultation with people who are not just the consumers of energy as well as the producers. And it could also open up more livelihoods because there could be room for people to get into the renewable energy business. I think this is a good example of where government's policy needs to be clear, transparent, so that everybody understands where it is you're headed. And that way you can get more investors in the sector. I find that a troubling scenario that you just described, because as long as energy prices remain as high as they are in the Bahamas, it'll be very, very difficult for things to get better on the cost of it.
I'll be brief. I think it was interesting when you saw, the threat to impose tariffs on Canada, that energy was one of the areas that was initially eliminated because a lot of the Canadian oil comes into the Midwest, and that would have some really interesting implications for that part of the country. But then, these threats to allies, close allies, I've heard scenarios as like, well, Canada could reorient its oil exports to Europe. So I don't know what that'll ultimately mean other than maybe a reordering of some of these trades. I can follow up.
Okay, last question, thank you.
Thank you. David Kotak. The question that you ask about reducing prices, which was a political question in the United States and elsewhere, and it's profound if we think about price level instead of a single price such as gasoline or eggs. And if we look at the history many, many years ago, that I don't want to count them all, I wrote a paper at Wharton about prices and price levels. Do we really want to reduce the price level? And does history say anything good about attempts which reduced the price level? The Great Depression, we reduced the price level, and the unemployment rate went to 25%. And if in the development of the Global Interdependence Center, there's now a division called, or a section called the College of Central Bankers. And who's in it? Former governors and former presidents of central banks from around the world. We just had a symposium about that in New York. And on the private dialogue day, one of the former governors of a central bank described the step function of central banking. You get an inflation flare, the central bank has to fight the inflation flare. It succeeds eventually at a cost. Inflation levels out for a while. Then you get another one. But the cost of driving the price level back down is so severe that no political society can tolerate it. So what we can't get to say, because it's very difficult for Pat Harker to say, I'm in the business of managing a step function with a price level. And if I can level it out at 2% or 3%, a tolerable low number, that's a success. Because we don't want to drive the price level back down. We don't want that pain. And my suspicion is not one of us in this room would like to have that. So the answer is more chickens, more eggs, get the price of eggs down, but let's accept the price level and try to make it as stable as we can, because that's really the best we could do. Just a suggestion.
Thank you. We're gonna thank you very much to our panelists for this global economic outlook section. Reese Jones and Mr. Callan. I think very practical
Okay, cool.
set of comments. Thank you.